All right. I'm seeing our virtual Zoom room is being populated with people from around the world. Welcome everyone to this space for conversation, for dialogue on UNEP at 50. We're here to celebrate the United Nations Environment Programme as it prepares to enter its fifth decade and beyond. And we will be starting very shortly with a conversation with Achim Steiner. David Cash, the Dean of the McCormack Graduate School for Policy and Global Studies, will kick us off this second dialogue in the UNEP at 50 series with Achim Steiner to welcome us. If we were in person, we would be in at UMass Boston right now, but it's actually fantastic that we are online so we could welcome people from around the world. So, Dean Cash.
Thank you so much, Professor Ivanova, and it's phenomenal to be a part of these discussions, this series of discussions where we will bring in, I should say, Professor Ivanova and her team will be bringing in thought leaders from all over the world to discuss what are incredibly important and timely issues. There's so much about those of us who are on this Zoom from the United States who are looking very carefully at our domestic policy, but we also know that that there's been huge concerns about the role the United States has played in global policy and politics, but also we're not the only players. This is a world of countries and regions and peoples that are trying to determine our collective future, and really difficult problems, policy problems, cultural problems, and organizational problems. And Professor Ivanova has brought to the table this phenomenal book, The Untold Story of the world's leading environmental institution, UNEP at 50, that in her inimitable style as a researcher, grounded in a form of research that we often think of as, when you think of kind of engaged research, you think of scholars who work at the local community with local partners that are right in the neighborhood. Professor Ivanova has expanded the notion of community. It's a global community that she works within. It's a global community of experts, of researchers, of scientists, of bureaucrats. And I always say bureaucrats with humble, loving kindness, because I think bureaucrats are one of the things that make the world go around in effective ways. But she is, as an engaged researcher, she works within that community, and those community members are engaged with her research. And that's why the findings from this phenomenal book are going to be that much more important. It's such a pleasure to have Achim Steiner here. He doesn't know it, but he and I share at least two things. One is he lives in Brooklyn now, and my mother was born and grew up in Brooklyn. So we have a connection there. But the other is that he is undertaking the remarkable feat of having been the administrator of the UNEP, the Environment Program, and now the administrator of UNDP, often seen, a development program, often seen as being at odds with one another or having completely different portfolios. And the thing that I share with him is that when I was in Massachusetts state government, I at one point was the energy commissioner that regulated gas and electric companies. And then I followed that with being the environment commissioner. And in fact, at the time, I was the only commissioner in the country that had worn those two hats. And I'm really interested, Achim, in hearing as you talk about what that transition means and what it's going to mean for UNEP at 51 and at 55 and at 100, when we have leaders like you who have worn both those hats, who understand the implications of the connection between E and D. And so I'm really looking forward to that part of the discussion. But now why don't I hand it back to Professor Ivanova and we start this discussion. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you very much, Dean Cash. And thank you for the over 100 participants who are now in this Zoom room. And before we begin, I'd like to invite you to engage in the chat. We have Prince de Makele, one of our doctoral students in the Global Governance and Human Security PhD program, who will be moderating the chat, engaging with you. And please put in your questions in the Q&A space. And we have one of our graduates of the PhD program, Natalia Escobar-Pemberti, who will be moderating that and feeding those questions to us as we engage in a discussion with Achim Steiner. So Achim is the guest today, and he needs no introduction. But he heads the development arm now of the United Nations, the UN Development Program, and has played such a critical role in the United Nations as a whole, and has been such an outspoken promoter of its core values and principles. However, Achim came to the UN from civil society. In September 2005, at the high-level plenary meeting of the 60th session of the UN General Assembly, Achim Steiner took the floor. He was representing civil society then as Director General of IUCN and addressed member states saying the following: in order to make poverty history, we need to make the environment the future. Less than 1 year later, in June of 2006, Achim Steiner was appointed as Executive Director of the UN Environment Program of UNEP. And on his first day as UNEP's Executive Director, he reiterated his commitment to connecting poverty and ecosystem vitality, saying, and I quote, "For too long, economics and environment have seemed like players on rival teams. There have been a lot of nasty challenges and far too many own goals. We need to make these two sides of the development coin team players on the same side." So today we have the honor of engaging in a conversation about the experience of Achim Steiner on both teams, in both positions, in environment and development, and the future of multilateralism. Welcome, Achim, to this space.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Professor Cash. Also, great pleasure to join you, and great opportunity to catch up with you, Maria, also, because this, you promised, was going to be a conversation. So I'm very much looking forward to it.
Exactly. We launched this series, Achim, with a very clear goal: to commemorate the 50th anniversary of UNEP, to learn from the 50 years of history, and to imagine the next 50. So today in this space, we will think about the opportunities, we will think about the vision, we will think about the potential for transformation of UNEP, of UNDP, and indeed of multilateralism more broadly. So let's start with you. First, let's start about learning about Achim Steiner, the individual. Who is Achim Steiner today, and what evolution has he undergone being on both teams?
Well, in some ways, I was thinking when you posed that question, in a sense, I'm a child of Rio. I mean, not only because, you know, I was born in Brazil, and I see we also have some Brazilian participants, so muito bom dia, Brazil. But also because Rio, the Earth Summit, really is the moment in which a new way of looking at the future was born or articulated. I mean, it had been called for, it had been discussed, it had been researched already, but I think we all look to 1992 in a way as the moment in which we began to understand that we cannot segment the future into either causes or sectors or a kind of hierarchy of economy followed by social, followed by environment. So my own journey, if you want, is one of trying to weave these threads together to understand that, you know, looking at the world through an environmental lens is not about being an environmentalist. It is to bring the best of what an environmental science, an environmental understanding, an environmental respect for life on Earth can bring to essentially what we as human beings decide to do next, because the environment, in a sense, could easily live without us. We cannot live without the environment. And that has always been sort of my departure point. And from there on, the journey has been one in which, you know, having been born in Brazil in the 1960s, having grown up to always look at the inequality and poverty issues as central to something that is not right about our world, I nevertheless found myself through university and then later in my early years of working, increasingly realizing that that environmental Achilles heel to the future of humanity was the one that I wanted to focus on, because I really felt that it was ignored, it was misunderstood, and for some it was just an excuse to simply go on with business as usual. And so the journey really began from a very human perspective, a very personal, view of where I would like to focus, to then an increasingly clear realization that environment was going to be the great variable of the 21st century, and what happens to us, what happens to life on Earth. And I was lucky and fortunate enough to find myself in fascinating institutions and contexts and countries from which I learned, and which over time I began to also, I think, craft a perspective that I think allowed us to look into the future, where environment is not something that we only describe in terms of its destruction, or that economists only look in terms of constraints, but it's actually the great opportunity of our time. So that in a nutshell is a little bit that sort of journey from a point of being born and having actually visited Rio even before the summit, and seeing also, I think, the world, in 1972, I was, what was I, 11, 12 years old. I mean, I was not running around thinking about the Stockholm conference, to be very honest. And yet, where I am today, leading the United Nations Development Program, is in some ways almost coming full circle, because I left university as a development economist, as somebody who looked at the opportunity of development as an economic paradigm shift, and then spent much of my life really becoming deeper and deeper engaged in that environmental dimension of it. And now having this wonderful opportunity that the Secretary General gave me in the General Assembly to lead the organization within the UN that is, in a sense, the place where these different threads come together.
Excellent. And we will delve into the connection between these two organizations. We've received a lot of questions even beforehand about these two. But let's just step back and begin with what I have called the anchor institution for the global environment, UNEP, that you led from 2006 to 2016. Achim, how would you describe UNEP in a few words? What do people need to know about it?
Well, let me make the segue to your book. I think you gave it a wonderful heading when you said, looking to the future, it is the champion of the earth. In some ways, that was the beginning of UNEP in 1972, giving a multilateral mandate, voice, and platform to that growing number of people who had been knocking on the doors of societal and economic debates about what was happening to our environment. You can go back to Rachel Carson and people like that, who were the pioneers of opening our eyes to not only the science of ecological or destruction or pollution impacts, the role of ecosystems, which obviously has a much longer tradition. And if you really want to look at the genesis of an understanding of our relationship as human beings with the planet, we go really into thousands of years of indigenous peoples' understanding and ways of living with the earth, so to speak. But let's say in that post-war era, when rivers were, turning brown, when, fish weren't swimming anymore, but turning up on top of the rivers dead, when cities were so polluted you couldn't see the skies anymore, people were dying as a result of development. That was, in a sense, the 1972 moment. And I think what the world was looking for, that within the United Nations family, within that discourse of nations talking to each other about the future, an understanding of environment was essential, and we needed a champion within the United Nations system. And UNEP has often been described, and you also allude to it, as sort of the unfulfilled promise, or that dream that with the establishment of UNEP, suddenly rivers would flow upstream and things would be just turned upside down. No, it was a marker. It was a brave marker at the time, and it was one that was deliberately constrained in terms of its potential impact initially, because it was promising disruption. And yet it had to be put in place because the public and necessity demanded it. So I think from its early days, what UNEP has combined is this wonderful ability to bring science and knowledge into the mainstream of where we need to make decisions about life, about our societies, our economies, and yet be an advocate. UNEP is one of the few entities in the United Nations system that has an explicit advocacy mandate on behalf of planet and people. And I think that, to me, is at the core of where we would like to believe UNEP began. There are many other threads and stories that you have told in your book, and I know that not all of them are necessarily compatible with each other.
That's right. And that's why, in a sense, the title came up to be The Untold Story. And indeed, the untold stories. And we would love to solicit more untold stories from people who know the organization, who have contributed or who have observed it in various ways. And so let's just talk a little bit more about it in terms of what kind of organization did you step into? This advocacy mandate that you refer to, in a sense, is almost at odds or within the international relations field, where we say states are the principals, international organizations are the agents, they have to do what states tell them to do. And yet we observe in action that the organizations often shape the narrative, they shape the priorities, and in collaboration, in this co-creation with the states. But so you, when you were leading UNEP, you jump-started the Green Economy Initiative. You spearheaded the Green Economy Initiative and the finance. And that has begun to foreshadow the agenda across the UN that we're seeing now. So can you talk a little bit about almost this tension between being a leader and being a follower in that relationship with nation states and your actions as a leader in UNEP?
You mentioned earlier on, I addressed the United Nations General Assembly as the head of IUCN, a civil society organization in the larger sense, although it also has states as members, and then found myself a year later leading UNEP. And the big decision that I had to take for myself in leaving IUCN, an organization that I loved leading and working with, and that taught me a great deal about what I think subsequently has allowed me to bring to the roles that I have been given, was the decision to accept that when you lead a United Nations organization, you don't give up on the notion of speaking truth to power. You don't shy away from ensuring that facts and science are brought to the attention of the public, but you also accept that you are ultimately not the supra-authority that tells member states what to do. The strength of the UN, of multilateralism, from its 1945 beginnings, was always about convening the world. And, people often lament that, the Security Council cannot agree on things. There is so much division in the United Nations. And my first response always is, well, that's precisely why we have a United Nations, not because we're all united, but because we have to work in unison despite our differences, despite very different interests. And nothing brought that more into relief than 1972, the Stockholm Conference. That was the culmination of a parallel discourse about environment and development. And we spent the next 30 years locked into a kind of zero-sum game. And so when I was given the opportunity to become the executive director of UNEP, to me, it was, first of all, learning from my predecessors who, with great vision and courage, had picked issues, had picked moments, had picked and built coalitions that allowed the world to do extraordinary things. We often forget that the most successful environmental treaty is the Montreal Protocol, genuinely curated and facilitated by the United Nations Environment Program. Its executive director nearly got fired over providing that leadership at the time because he spoke truth to power. He brought the science into the public realm, and that was not comfortable for political leaders, but it's what societies were expecting. And embracing that dynamic that you are not there to tell countries what to do, but to enable them, first of all, to understand what needs doing, secondly, to convene them and allow them to find better ways forward. And then thirdly, connecting brilliant ideas. I think part of what multilateralism, what UNEP has done over 50 years almost, is to allow countries to learn from one another. you know, we all don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. We learn from, you know, public policies, from fiscal policy, science policy, R&D, ecosystem management approaches. Those are, in a sense, the hows. And I think when you look at the various key moments in UNEP's history, it has been at the center of virtually every major leap forward. The IPCC, again, it was UNEP and WMO who helped the world establish an independent forum for science on climate change to speak truth to power and to the world, and, you know, co-hosts it to this day. IPBES on biodiversity, the International Resources Panel, and I could go on. Those are the moments when, you know, enough consensus had been built beyond the imperative to do something, which has been there for decades. And in a sense, we have lost many, many years in trying to bring the world together. But here I often remind people that, you know, the United Nations does not operate by dictate. It is in part a product of where the world is, and in part helps the world to advance where it wants to get to. And it's in that interplay that I think much of what one can appreciate about the unique value lies. And when I arrived in UNEP, the time was ripe to finally tackle head-on this narrative that, you know, economies will suffer if they become more environmentally sustainable, and to change not only the understanding, we already knew that we had to act, but also to, in a sense, tackle head-on what was increasingly a misleading discourse that was paralyzing societies. And I think the Green Economy Initiative became a vehicle for UNEP to also allow the developing world to embrace the environmental sustainability imperative as something that spoke to their reality. And nowhere better to do that than in an organization that is headquartered in the heart of the African continent. I mean, I have often argued with people who say, oh, isn't it a problem that UNEP is headquartered in Nairobi? I think it was probably the most visionary decision, even if logistically challenging in the first 20 years, that was taken at the time, because UNEP is today at the heart of the continent that will define much of what happens next this century.
So many ideas that's just come out of this these statements, Achim, and we'll talk about leadership then in a little bit. But one issue that several people raised in the questions that they submitted beforehand is exactly this relationship between UNEP and UNDP, between environment and development. And several of your current, former colleagues, observers of the UN are asking, what would be the most promising specific area for a more strategic collaboration between UNEP and UNDP? Where do we take that sustainable development narrative that you were alluding to institutionally, structurally?
Well, you know, you spoke with Inger Andersen, UNEP's executive director, right now, and I think the way she responded to your question at the time was, I think, one where Inger and I absolutely see eye to eye. First of all, let me say, to those who, you know, often define their observations about the UN system as one of competition, yes, inevitably, institutions, you know, have ideas, they develop dynamic energy, and they also have to, yes, compete for funding. I mean, this is a reality that is out there. But frankly, when envy becomes a term that people use, I have very little time for that. I think envy is the absence of imagination. And Inger and I think, are very fortunate in that we have known each other for many years. We share a view of, I think, that sustainable development challenge of our time. And we both have the privilege of having worked in each other's institutions before, even before the UNEP-UNDP era. So I think we have a very clear view of it, which is that UNEP and UNDP are not identical organizations with different names. UNDP is a partner on the ground. It is present in 170 countries. It is above all an institution that accompanies countries in the search for their sustainable development solutions through projects, through policy reforms, through crises that arise. And it is an extraordinarily powerful infrastructure that the UN has built for itself as a UN development system to accompany countries. And one of the remarkable things when you join UNDP is you learn a great deal about how countries appreciate having an institution right next to them. Not telling them what to do, but helping them to decide what to do and then to help them try and do it. And UNEP in part needs to have its feet on the ground. That was always my argument also as executive director. So it's not just a normative organization, but it is in some ways the organization to which the world looks as, first of all, a global authority where science and information and knowledge are curated and brought together from a global and a planetary perspective. But at the same time, it's an institution that is not devoid of an understanding that knowledge without thinking about people and communities is largely irrelevant. So UNEP, I think, has also under the leadership of Inga's and my predecessors, always had a very strong human perspective. So that unites, first of all, UNDP's self-definition as being a human development organization in tradition and in history, and UNEP, which began as an environmental entity and yet did not exclude the human dimension either. Today, we are two sister organizations in the United Nations, and from my perspective, very personally speaking, complement each other ideally, because UNDP is not an environmental center of expertise. It has many environmental experts, but we look to UNEP for the, first of all, articulation of global priorities, bringing the latest science into the realm of policy making. But then you have to break it down. You have to work with real context in real countries with real challenges and dilemmas of prioritization, fiscal constraints. And that collaboration, I think, is the ideal relationship we can have. And at times it means we are both working in the same country on the ground. On other occasions, UNEP will contribute to a global discourse about sustainable development. And take climate change. We are working so closely together right now in helping countries to take their national climate strategies, these NDCs, to the next level, because in Glasgow, if we do not cross this threshold that the Paris Agreement set for itself, namely raising the level of ambition every 5 years, we will be in deep trouble. Joining forces, working with the Climate Convention, with the World Meteorological Organization and many other sister agencies, we are embedded in a global partnership to promote the ability of countries to act on climate change. And if there is, in a sense, let's say, weighting of how one enters into this room, I just came out of a session this morning about the high-level dialogue on energy that the UN is convening this September. And I made the point, this is a dialogue about energy. It's about how we will power our economies in the 21st century. It's not a climate change meeting, and yet the two are so inextricably linked, because the energy system of the future will define the future of the Paris Agreement, but also the future of 1 billion people who have no access to electricity as we speak today. That is sustainable development at its best, and the institutional landscape should align itself to that logic.
So on this institutional landscape, Achim, even from the very beginning, before UNEP's creation, there were a number of different multilateral agencies in the UN system, and all of them held a piece of that environmental puzzle. With the creation of UNEP, they expanded even further, and there is the whole set of multilateral environmental agreements. So how can we manage coordination better? Why is coordination in the UN so difficult, and how can it be done better?
Well, first of all, let me say, I think when you begin to spend more time thinking about how to coordinate than to actually do, you have reached the point where you need to rethink whether your institutional architecture is actually right. It's a colleague of ours who you know well also, Professor Neri Woods at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, who once said this very simple thing. Coordination is the absence of collaboration. And I think we do have an element in this coordination discussion where we just need to step back for a moment, because you mentioned the environmental governance universe, and I remain convinced that simply adding more and more conventions with all their own processes is unlikely to be the long-term future of environmental governance. And I think one key step that was taken in 2012 when the summit, the Rio +20 summit, established the United Nations Environment Assembly, is to essentially foreshadow a moment in which we begin to try and draw these threads together, because there are another 500 environmental conventions that will be needed, in inverted commas, over the next years, just to tackle different chemicals, different pollutants, different critical ecosystem functions, the marine realm. And I think where the world does need to think forward is not how to create ever more elaborate structures of how to keep everybody, choreographed in a sort of mega ballet, but to begin to redesign the platforms on which we actually shape that which the United Nations is meant to bring to the environment and sustainable development agenda, which is greater unity of purpose, greater cohesion in action, and not begin to focus on the means to an end, because neither UNEP nor a convention or UNDP are an end in themselves. They're supposed to be a means to an end. And I think that is one of the frontiers that is not only overdue in the environmental governance sphere. In fact, the Secretary General has also taken this on board in the UN reform agenda as a whole. We are a complex body. We are, we have grown in cumulative steps, new entities, new programs, new funds, new initiatives over the years. I think we are at the point where a rethink of how the system as a whole needs to reconsolidate itself. And that is not about, merging organizations necessarily, but it is about clearer delineation of mandates, how individual pieces fit into that rather than existing in a sort of galaxy of, intermittent encounters.
And on that point, let's think a little bit about leadership, because in that galaxy of intermittent encounters, when the personalities change, the dynamics change. And you referred to your relationship with Inger Anderson, who was the inaugural interlocutor in these dialogues. And it is very refreshing to see the two of you working hand in hand and bringing the environment and the development dimensions together. I still remember how you changed the narrative around the Rio +20 from the 3 pillars of environment, social issues, and economic issues, and where we can never integrate pillars, to the 3 dimensions that are overlapping, that allow for many more constellations. So what is the role of leadership in those constellations, and what do you think are the most important dimensions, and maybe some examples of particularly good leadership in any of the international organizations or in the UN system?
Well, it's not an easy question to answer, but I think let me first of all just echo what you said about that change of narrative. And I want to also remember somebody who in the environmental community is remembered with great fondness and respect, Angela Cropper. Because you may recall that Angela Cropper, for a couple of years, agreed to be the Deputy Executive Director of UNEP also. And it was for me a very unique moment also to, draw on somebody who is intellectual and practical understanding of this field of development and environment was, remarkable. She, at the time, used that phrase of the triple helix. And I think that image, to me, is precisely the image of our era. We began with dealing with a world that looked at development or the human condition from largely an economic perspective. Then, social inequality already in many wealthier countries became a driver for reform. And environment was the poor cousin that would come later. Once you're wealthy enough and you have basically built your cities and your infrastructure, then you worry about restoring the environment. Well, we live in the age of the Anthropocene. Human Development Report 2020, I'll only mention it briefly, that we published in December, a very deliberate attempt to try and understand what the era is in which we live. It worked for some of the time and made them wealthier and better off. It left the world a lot more scary and much more vulnerable. And so the moment in time in which we find ourselves, I think, here is critical. Now, from that triple helix understanding, I think whoever leads a UN institution, or indeed any organization, more eco and less ego, I think, must be the first departure point. If you allow your own sense of frustration, sometimes with a complicated institutional landscape, to drive your decision making, you become an amplifier of the dysfunctionality. And I've always tried to contain that. And none of us are free of it. Sometimes we get frustrated with our colleagues, or we see opportunities that we could have seized but others stopped. But leading a UN institution gives you an enormous responsibility, and I think leadership is such a critical factor. And your book, in so many aspects, explores these different facets of leadership. And failures and successes. All of us produce both of them. But I think therein lies an extremely important lesson. It's not that one person, one man or one woman determines what happens to an organization, but sometimes one person at the top can destroy a lot or can build a lot. And so I think that ecosystem of institutions that we have built as an international community that, you know, justifiably are looked at with also a skeptical and critical eye from time to time, are nevertheless extraordinarily important as a fabric for actually allowing us to now move forward together. And so I, you know, having left the United Nations after I, you know, left UNEP and gone to Oxford, at first I struggled a little bit with the notion of going back into this complex system. But I think it is precisely at this moment in time that the idea of the United Nations has never been more fundamentally relevant to what happens next. And so we live in that schizophrenia between institutional legacy structures, human psychology, and yet the promise of the United Nations. And I am so firmly convinced out of this pandemic, we have just been brutally reminded what happens when we think we can go it alone.
Thank you, Achim. And this is we'll move into the questions from I see a lot of questions from in the Q&A in the chat. Natalia will join us shortly and pose some of these. But before we do, I want to pull up a question, yes, from that space of yours when you were the leader of UNEP. One of your close friends and colleagues, John Scanlon, sent us a personal question and a professional question. Personally, John asks, Achim, how does it feel to be 60? And professionally, he says, how profound do you feel the impact of COVID-19 has been on governments and people's perceptions of our relationship with nature being out of balance? And how can we capitalize on this sentiment, noting that human memories are short, and once a crisis has passed, people can easily slip back into bad habits. So this allows you the opportunity to bring all of the insights that you were talking about. But let's start with that. How does it feel to be 60 when UNEP is celebrating 50, Achim?
Well, John is naughty, but greetings to John. And I can only say I have no answer for it because I suspended my counting of birthdays due to the pandemic. So I stopped at 59 and a half, and I can't answer the question yet. But, you know, in some ways, this year was not a year where you had much time to sort of reflect on such an anniversary. I mean, it has been since last February a non-stop battle to try and balance the ability of an institution. And, you know, when you head an organization with 18,000 people, it's an enormous weight of responsibility also for us as managers with my senior management team for the duty of care. So we had to, you know, figure out a way, would we be able to stay and support countries in the midst of this pandemic, which continues to rage, by the way, across the world. And, you know, whether it is in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, our colleagues are there, even in very complicated settings where conflict and crisis makes it almost impossible to even evacuate people if they get COVID. And we have no vaccines in most of these countries available for our staff either. So that responsibility, coupled with a very sharp understanding of how critical the UN family would prove to be at this moment in time, allowed very little sort of, you know, sitting back and thinking about what has happened. I think much of that will still dawn on us as we come out of the crisis moment. I think the tail of the pandemic will be long. It will be very harsh for many people, for many economies also. And so as the United Nations Development Program, as part of the UN's overall response on health, humanitarian, and the socioeconomic dimensions, my focus with my teams has been to particularly help countries manage a crisis, which is the absolute priority, but in managing the crisis, lay the groundwork also for a return to a development pathway that moves us forward. And there, you know, we have heard a lot about, you know, not going back to where we were before, build back better or build forward better. I think to John's point, yes, we forget quickly, but people actually don't forget. because remember 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, because a part of our society, a part of our economy thought that it could actually, move beyond that crisis and get back to business as normal, also gave rise to the Wall Street, Main Street phenomenon. And then remember the 2 years before COVID-19 hit us, we had riots across the world. We had societies falling apart, rich and poor, industrialized, developing countries. The tension around the development contradictions of inequality and lack of sustainability, intergenerational injustice that was beginning to become so clear with climate change, produced a generation of 14, 15-year-olds who are actually leading us in our response to climate change today. I think it is a phenomenal time. So I think, yes, there will be those who will just try to get back to where they were before, some of them making a lot of money doing it. So, that is part of their reason. But ultimately really being able to, I think, advance our thinking and just take climate change. We are further along getting to the Paris kind of goals right now in June of 2021 than we were in December of 2019. Just remember where the world was then, thinking ahead. So actually acceleration, transformation, transitions, I think are at the point where we will see more of that exponential curve beginning to drive change.
Excellent. So Natalia, if I know you have been monitoring the Q&A space and you can bundle some of the questions together. I know that Achim has to leave us at 12:30 sharp, our time, to join the UN Deputy Secretary General for another meeting. This is the benefit of this virtual reality. You have one minute in between cities. So Natalia, what are people asking, and where do we take the conversation before we finalize with the vision for UNEP at 100? I want to save some space for that, Achim, before you leave us today.
Great. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. As Maria, as you said, we're having lots of questions on the Q&A, so I am doing an effort here to try to summarize them by topics and see where can lead the discussion. And that final answer was the perfect introduction for this next question, as people want to know a little bit more about how this process is affecting the evolution of the 2030 agenda. Where do we stand? How do we see the environmental dimension of that, and specifically how we can use milestones or this recovery process or the 50th anniversary next year as a point of measure towards like a milestone towards the completion of the agenda in 2030. So if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Great question, and a difficult one to answer in a fair way. I had the privilege of learning with one of my bosses, Professor Kader Asmal, who was the chair of the World Commission on Dams. And when I first joined him, he said, Achim, I would like us to write a report that doesn't tell me what my problem is. I know my problem. Tell me what the solution is. So I can absolutely say without hesitation, we have just gone through a major setback in terms of the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, the indicators and the targets. And you've seen the numbers from the ILO, from the WHO, UNICEF, IMF, World Bank. I mean, we are constantly updating the toll of tragedy that this pandemic has unleashed on us as a global family. And then there are some who are beginning to experiment with the narrative that maybe we should just give up on the 2030 agenda. The SDGs are no longer relevant. There are such setbacks. We cannot meet the targets that we have set for ourselves. And here I take a very different viewpoint. I think the unique value of this 2030 agenda, the SDGs, is that, in 2015, we actually agreed with 193 nations on the great threats of our time, on what the key priorities would be for having to work together, and thirdly, for how we would actually be able to measure and monitor progress. And I think the SDGs remain a remarkable design template, not for some global panacea, but rather for how we begin to design development interventions that now have become even more challenged because of the crisis, but that really look at the opportunity for investing, for example, in action on access to energy, by also investing in a energy agenda, in a climate agenda, in dealing with health and access to clean cooking for so many women of the world, in the green jobs that this will produce, in the electrification of mobility, the hydrogen economy. When you start looking at this, you actually need to take a step back and say, we have just seen a number of countries mobilize around the notion of a Green Deal, a green recovery, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of investments that were unimaginable even 5 years ago. So yes, it is not in every country. It is partial. But I think if I were to take what is my natural instinct, which is to look at the possibilities rather than at the doomsday scenario, then I would say, as we have also just explored with the University of Denver, when we took a SDG integration view and explored 3 scenarios, essentially a sort of collapse scenario, another one an SDG push scenario, and another one kind of meddling through. The SDG push scenario is actually viable. We could, by 2030, in a number of areas, actually see many countries and societies, and even in a global context, advance significantly, but not by going back to where we were in 2019. I mean, this is the great moment of choice. And I think the SDGs are even more relevant because they allow us to prioritize and to design smart investments and interventions. You cannot solve and even come out of a crisis like this by picking one issue and saying this is the only thing that matters. You can try and understand that the 2 drivers of, I think, the new social contract that we're all grappling with in our societies, but also as a global family in the 21st century, will revolve around this issue of equity and sustainability. I mean, clearly these are the 2 defining variables of economic models, social models, environmental management models. So my answer to the question would be, I remain firmly convinced that the SDGs is something that we should use for what they are. Not the miracle formula, but a unique instrument that brings us together, sharpens our focus, and allows a smarter design of investments and public finance to happen. And now we need to make choices, and that's where our leaders, our political leaders, are needed, because they at the moment are feeling the pressure. That's why we have seen a European $1 trillion and a US $1 trillion announcement, and the story goes on. Yet Oxford and UNEP, in their recent research, also began to put a spotlight on the fact that so far, in the stimulus packages, a relatively small proportion is really genuinely being invested in that transition. Now, partly understandable, it was stabilizing free fall industries and sectors, but the next 6 to 24 months are going to be defining in terms of whether we come out of this pandemic with an accelerated transformation of our economies, or we are locking ourselves in, and then we would be truly in trouble. And then the SDGs become a distraction, if that were to be the case.
Thank you. Another area in which our participants would like to get your perspective is the vision for the Stockholm Plus 50 conference. And there are like 3 areas that I think come from our questions. What should be the ambition of that conference? What they can do differently in terms of what the previous summits have not been able to do? And how they can also contribute to adjusting these governance architectures to the changing world and to bring like the organizations up to the challenge of these dynamics that will come up in the next 50 years. Maybe those 3 are the same in your perspective, but there are 3 critical points there for the upcoming Stockholm Plus 50 summit.
Well, let me put it in very simple terms. 1972, the Stockholm Conference was all about what had gone wrong in the past. And in some ways, the next step to try to begin to fix this, including the creation of the United Nations Environment Program. I think Stockholm Plus 50 should be unapologetically focused on the future. what is going to happen in the future? How do we make choices that allow us to shape the future that we take? And I go back to this, discourse around the Anthropocene. To some, the Anthropocene is a very dark way of looking at reality, because it describes really the planetary impact of human existence and human choices. But the other half of the Anthropocene discourse is really that we are the generation that is most empowered and most able to exercise different choices. And so I think Stockholm plus 50 has to be about the realm of possibility if you get that environmental dimension of development right. If sustainable development truly begins to be restorative and regenerative, it maintains the vital ecosystem functions, our planetary life support systems. And I think therein lies the power of Stockholm plus 50, not a gathering of the environmental regrets, but an articulation and an inspiration of the environmental drivers of the future that can very quickly be translated into economic, into social, into industrial, into agriculture, into food system agendas, and where UNEP, and I think this is the second part, has a very central role to play. I think we do need to build on that, unique, if somewhat hesitant, step forward with establishing a universal environment assembly. We need to bring greater cohesion to that collective understanding of how environment will define economic and human well-being. And I think we have to overcome the incrementalism of the last 50 years, which was not irrational, nor was it wrong. It was what was feasible. But incrementalism in an era of transformation actually is a hindrance. And I think therein lies the second major impulse out of Stockholm plus 50. How do we strengthen the environmental governance platform for the world without pretending that, in Nairobi, there is a captain on the bridge who will kind of tell the world now how to do things next, because that will never work.
Let me jump in here, Achim, and ask you, in that setting, in that vision, what is the role for academia? This is something we've been discussing for quite a few years, and it's almost a stop and go type process, but we have to imagine a new world. We have unlimited access to young people that then grow older and become professionals. But what could academia do in this setting, in the 2030 agenda, the Stockholm plus 50, the UNEP at 50? How can we engage better in the UN?
Well, I probably have a biased answer to this, because as you know, after leaving Nairobi, I had the great fortune of being appointed to direct the Oxford Martin School, which was to me a fantastic combination of embedding yourself in an academic institution, but with James Martin's vision that the great challenge of the 21st century required interdisciplinary research and also a more osmotic relationship between academia and research in its independence, in its integrity, and where society is grappling with problems. And the Oxford Martin School is, a principal example of precisely that ambition, which many universities, and you are in the midst of it as well, Maria, have been experimenting with. I think universities, academics, including in the way not only that they do research, but in the way that they also teach and ultimately shape the next generation of leaders, is fundamental. And it's been one of my aspirations, let me put it this way, in my tenure in UNDP, to associate UNDP far more closely to centers of learning and research. And we are privileged enough to work with dozens of universities across the world, and with some in very deep partnerships also, precisely because it is also in an evolving world of academic research that we find many of the impulses, sometimes also the ability to look a step ahead and understand what is going to happen next, because as an academician you are more able to, beyond institutional and political realities, focus on that realm of possibility, be it scientific, technological, or social reform agendas. And so UNDP is, I say with some excitement today, in significant relationships, thinking relationships with the academic world, not least through the work of the Human Development Report, but not only there. That is central, I think, to our ability to use the organization, and I know Inga will say the same thing about UNEP, to amplify thought leadership. I mean, we are not there to dictate to the world what to do, but the world does expect UNEP or UNDP to provide thought leadership, which is different from, you know, declaring what somebody should be doing. And I think that is a critical role that we can play in that interplay with academics.
Thank you, Achim. We have just a few minutes before we have to close for today. Natalia is telling me there is one burning question from the Q&A, which actually feeds into my final question. But the question from the Q&A is, what are the lessons from UNEP to UNDP, from UNEP to UNDP, and then what is your vision for UNEP at 100? What can we imagine that we will be celebrating in 50 years from now?
Lessons from UNEP to UNDP. I think for many years, the view of an environmental organization from the vantage point of UNDP was a niche organization. And I think that began to change, obviously, you know, many years ago. But I think what UNEP has been able to give expression to is that environment is both, you know, in one sense, a very specific area of expertise, but it is also one that must permeate every decision-making process in our daily lives. And so UNEP's great strength, I think, has been to remain focused on the frontier of knowledge, while at the same time, through the resource panel, through IPBS, through IPCC, through the geo reports, I mean, the emissions gap report, I mean, just to mention some, you know, truly significant products that the organization has produced to bring this really to the front door of everyone. And you know, when I had the privilege of leading UNEP, the Green Economy Report became the door opener to the entire UN system, to the Chief Executive Board, to debate what the implications of this would be, because UNEP has been good at understanding that it does not own the environmental agenda. It is there to curate it, to mature it, to disseminate it, and to push and advocate for it. The greatest success, and I, in that sense, feel very comfortable where I am now, is I always said when I was in Nairobi, it's a great thing if an organization like UNDP does a lot of work on environmental issues. This is what we are trying to achieve. Development must be environmentally sustainable. And so respect for the uniqueness of a specialized entity like UNEP, I think, is also something that I have maintained here, vis-a-vis others as well. And at the same time, I think UNEP's constraint to some extent, which it can only overcome in very strategic partnerships, is how do you take something to scale when you are an organization that, you know, manages to employ 1,000 people, that is meant to do an extraordinary amount of things, is under-resourced chronically. I think it is to continue to search for those catalytic products and strategic partnerships that ultimately have made it, yes, maybe the untold story, but in that title, Maria, lies a little bit of a tragedy also, because behind that untold story are hundreds of extraordinary stories that we simply take for granted. The fact that the ozone layer is recovering should be something we should be celebrating every year, and yet the world just seems to take it for granted. And this is over 30 years of science, public policy, advocacy, private sector, technology, at work, so to speak. And 100 years from now, well, the first thing I would say is I hope the world will still have a United Nations. I'm not sure, because, you know, complacency, benign neglect, inertia, geopolitical tensions, all of these are, you know, sometimes converging towards undermining the foundations of this extraordinary moment in 1945. And I always say, you know, we are a privileged generation in that we are able to have a United Nations, remember what the world looked like in 1939, 1942, 1944, 45, when we had lost that. And to rediscover our passion for not a bureaucracy, but for the idea, and then to put our weight behind that idea, I think that will be the first thing that I think determines whether multilateralism is still something we can count on and draw on. Within that, some years ago I said, I think, you know, a Minister of Finance is always considered the most powerful portfolio and, you know, influential in a government. I think the Minister of Environment, if there are still Ministers of Environment, will be the other one. One looks after the monetary wealth, the other one looks after the ecological wealth of a nation. And I think UNEP will emerge perhaps alongside the IMF as that custodian of understanding that what wealth is in the 21st century is not just measured in terms of bank accounts and GDP. That remains, I think, a uniquely precious role for it to strive towards. And it may take us till, you know, another 50 years from now to finally have broken the back of this very powerful but very narrow-minded view of measuring progress in our world.
Well, Achim, thank you very much for joining us, for articulating that vision. And I will start working on the book UNEP at 75 right now, and all of the told stories. So please, people who are joining us today, look on the website, give us your untold story so we can share them with the world. And submit your stories. Let's write that history for UNEP at 75. We will continue the dialogue series in September. We'll take a break for the summer, and our guest in September will be Wanjira Mathai, the daughter of Wangari Maathai, the agent who pushed UNEP from outside and from Nairobi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner that passed away in 2011, but whose legacy we keep on moving forward. So join us in September, and till then, wishing you a wonderful summer. Achim, thank you for joining us, and have a great day.